The motion for today's debate is, this House supports France's exit from West Africa. Representing the proposition, we have the team from Croatia, and on the opposition, we have the team from South Africa. From the proposition side, our speakers are, first speaker, Alana Sreća, second speaker, Lea Pogač, third speaker, Domagoj, reply speaker, Lea Pogač. On the opposition side, our speakers are, first speaker, Kumu K, second speaker, Nisa, third speaker, Kumu M, reply speaker, Nisa. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which points of information can be offered, and will signal the return to protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of the speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judge will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams. I now hand over the floor to our chair judge.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to round 7 of WSDC 2024. All report regarding round 4. My name is Lupu. I use he, him, and they and pronouns, but I prefer that you address the panel as a whole. I'll be the chair of this round. I'll invite the panelists to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Annette, and my pronouns are she, her. Hi, I'm she, her.
All right, wonderful. So 2 requests from the panel. First of all, at the top of your speech, please just remind us of your name and the speech you're about to deliver. Just to make sure we have that formally on record when we're not working on panel submission and so on. Second, for timekeeping, I'll be using the app. So can I just check that everyone can hear the sound? Yeah. Perfect. So you'll hear 1 bell at 1 minute, 1 bell at 7, 2 bells at 8, 3 at 8:15, and at 8:30, I'll put my head down and raise my hands like this, show that I'm not flowing. Anything you say beyond that point is not making it onto the formal record. Are there any questions before we begin? Fantastic. With that said, on the motion that this House supports France's exit from West Africa, I welcome the first member of the proposition.
Okay, my name is Lana. I'm the first speaker, and can you hear me if I speak like this? Great. Okay. Last year, France made 17% of their GDP from colonial tax imposed on former colonies, which is more than the GDP of Norway. When France sends its army to protect people from terrorism, they end up only protecting French mines and factories. To this day, France has ill intentions and it has to get out. In my speech, 2 arguments. First, about economy, second, about the development of ECOWAS. But before that, a few points of framing. What does France exiting West Africa look like? First, on the political level, it will cut ties, but will still have diplomacy and consulates. On the economic level, trade deals, import and export can still exist, but French majority ownership of African national companies, particularly in raw resources, is no longer possible. Our alternative is to privatize, which implies the entry of foreign investors. The West CFA franc must be dissolved as a currency. France's exit has to include exiting from Africa's monetary policy. On the military level, all French troops get withdrawn. What likely happens on our side is that West African countries have similar monetary needs. They're export-based economies and are already in an extensive trade union like ECOWAS. This likely means that these countries band together under the same currency as regulated by their own central bank. First argument then about the economy. How is France damaging the West Africa economy? Primarily by imposing the CFA franc. It is a currency adopted by West African countries that is controlled by France. Printing, distribution, reserves. It is pegged to the euro under fixed exchange rate. There are 2 detrimental characteristics of it. First, the artificially high exchange rate. It favors imports to the detriment of exports, because when countries with strong currencies would trade with the West African countries, they will gain money by switching currency, whereas when CFA franc is pegged to the euro, a strong currency, other countries lose money by trading. The implication of this is when they have a lower exchange rate, they're a more attractive trading partner. On op, African countries cannot use their own currency as an instrument to boost price competitiveness. Second point, that reserves of West Africa are in France. Half of the money that West African countries have has to be in France. West African countries only have access to 20% of the revenue they generated in the prior year at any given time, which means that any project government wants to do has to be within the bounds of the budget. For example, when building an electrical grid, governments are unlikely to have the capital to upscale the grid to a size that would meet demands of its most residents in the capital city, let alone areas around it. Furthermore, West African governments lose liquidity. Most money that they have is tied up in ongoing projects and government expenditure. Liquid money remains in France. This means governments have a much tougher time dealing with crisis situations or unforeseen expenses. Droughts, natural disaster, crises like COVID-19. Responses to these events are too slow and inadequate because France needs to determine whether the claim is legitimate and how much or when to transfer money. The impact of this is of both points is seen in the example of Ivory Coast, the largest CFA franc country, whose GDP per capita is 1/3 lower than before the implementation of CFA franc. Our comparative here is that first, when West African countries don't have CFA franc, they can adjust their own currency to be more appropriate for international trade of raw resources. Secondly, West African countries get their own money directly. They get their half of GDP from reserves back, which means they have more money on hand. This means that West African countries now have the capacity to invest into things its people need. Agriculture, hospital, I'll take you later, manufacturing industries, water systems. This is especially important because none of West African citizens deserve a lower quality of life. They're stuck here due to birth lottery. Given that their lives are unbelievably difficult, fixing this injustice is a priority. Now a point.
Do you support America's exit out of Afghanistan?
I don't see how this is relevant to this. I will just continue. I don't see how this is relevant. Second argument then about the development of ECOWAS. What is ECOWAS? This is an economic community of West African states. They have aspirations of trade liberalization and creating a common currency between member states. It is currently not very influential or active because of France. Because first, most of ECOWAS's goals are much easier to accomplish with a common currency, such as fair trade between nations. Secondly, ECOWAS member states are afraid of pivoting trade to each other. Right now, France is a big provider of local economic projects. Over 10% of Burkina Faso's foreign economic aid comes from France. They're afraid if they devote more resources to each other, France might backlash by pulling back support. This also creates first mover disadvantage for initiating trade liberalization projects. Why is ECOWAS more active on prop? When France pulls out, first, it presents opportunity to create common currency if CFA franc is gone. West African countries benefit from having a shared currency as it makes trade between each other easier. They will likely want one after the CFA franc is dissolved. ECOWAS is the only body with the ability and political legitimacy to implement this. Note, the only reason these incentives don't manifest in the status quo is because of CFA franc's presence. Second point, how this creates export value. African countries are very likely to recognize the need to depend more on each other for trade. Because first, there's going to be an interim period before complex economic ties or deals are established, which can last for years. Economic growth and supply are still necessary then. Secondly, on suspicion. These countries are not likely to risk full trade and investment dependence on another foreign power again. Voters are unlikely to believe dependence on any foreigners is reliable after historical presence like France leaves. How is this beneficial for West Africa? Two main reasons. First, economic reasons. On A, bargaining power. Like any large economic union, big trade deals are likely to be mediated through the union rather than individual countries. Common resources like oil, uranium, or cocoa will likely be pooled between these nations and bargained with as a group. Grouping resources gives West Africa control over the majority of a certain product on the market, giving them bargaining power and control over pricing. More money per product sold means more money to the individual countries. This is very important that these are export-based nations, which will bring to significant boost to the GDP then. B, on circulation of capital. Instead of consumers' money going into the developed world, it gets spent on African products and African industries, staying in West Africa. Second point about security reasons. ECOWAS also functions as a military union of all involved nations. It pulls military power from West Africa and either directly involves itself in conflict or gives armed support to countries which need it. In the status quo, its security function isn't relevant because it is insufficiently funded and lacks authority. Note how our argument mechanizes why this changes. ECOWAS would be more successful in perpetuating African stability through fighting back internal insurgencies and terrorists in member states. Important examples of when ECOWAS was more influential and succeeded in this is when ECOWAS led the AFISMA mission in 2013 to destroy an almost successful coup attempt on Mali. ECOWAS would also be more successful in fighting back against terrorist forces than individual French or Chinese military bases in West Africa. ECOWAS would have insights into connected terrorist cells between countries, access to military generals who have been active in the region since Islamic terror or insurgency groups rose. This is the exclusive benefit of ECOWAS: incentive and capacity for all involved countries to share security info. On OP, African militaries can outsource responsibility to the French military as it is perceived as the most legitimate military in the area. They do this due to scarce resources that need to be allocated elsewhere. Overall, if ECOWAS was given an opportunity to grow, first, African economies would grow alongside it. Secondly, through creation and growing legitimacy of ECOWAS, African states would be far more likely to reduce tensions and de-escalate wars between each other. And thirdly, African states would be significantly more successful in fighting back of terrorists and insurgents. Both sides here aspire to give Africa a better future. Only on our side we can show you how we do this. So I beg you to propose. Thank you.
I'll stand to the first proposition to speak of those remarks, and that's the first proposition to speak.
Name Kumuk Mahler, pronouns he, him. I'll be the opposition first speaker. Okay. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. In Mali, fake graves were designed to discredit French forces. A massacre of some 300 people, mostly civilians, with all evidence pointing to the shadowy mercenary group, the Russian Wagner group. This is a direct result of the increased presence of the Wagner group as a result of the French exit. Strategically, why are they already losing this debate? Because panel, this is a this House supports motions, i.e. they have to defend how France has exited in status quo. All that they give you is they're pushing potential benefits that they may get in the long run, but they fail to recognize the instability that's likely to exist within that country, but they also fail to recognize that ECOWAS is just not a military defense force. What's our stance today? Our stance is that France's withdrawal from the region has been worse for stability within the region for 2 reasons. Firstly, one, it's enabled nefarious actors to seize and entrench control, but secondly, it's harmed the economy. What was France's initial goals? We think France's involvement in the region was heightened in 2012 after the Malayan government requested assistance in fighting against terrorist groups within the northern country. The Tuareg rebels, which were closely associated with Al-Qaeda, had a threat to the region. Following the success of this mission, we think France launched the Operation Bacard, which committed 5,000 soldiers to the region in 2014. However, due to a lack of perceived success, which led to a growing anti-French sentiment, France gradually decreased the presence within the region. It looks like the French in Mali and the Imber encampment reaching their highs of 75,000 refugees in 2013, and it dropped to the lows of 41,000 refugees in 2016, but has been increasingly rising post-2018 as a result of France's exit. Secondly then, we think France's withdrawal from the region allowed for the increase in anti-French sentiment, which resulted in coups against pro-France government. It looks like coup leaders in Niger having accused French forces of freeing captured terrorists and breaching the ban on the country's airspace in an attempt to destabilize Niger, even though the French continue to claim they had no involvement within this. What then becomes the likely alternative if we do not support the exit? 3 things. Firstly, 1, France would have instead of starting to withdraw, kept the presence within the region and maintained commitments to combating counterterrorism. Secondly, it means that they would have pivoted towards establishing strong democratic institutions and norms. It looks like becoming a transitionary government and negotiating, similar how it was done in South Africa with the apartheid government, which guaranteed democracy for the people on the ground. But thirdly then, it looks like putting general greater resistance to combat the narratives that France's presence was inherently neo-colonial and therefore harmful. Because note how this allowed for propaganda through Russia and proxy groups such as the Wagner Group, which mobilized individuals to actively push the French out. But secondly then, we have the ability to then ensure that coups are unlikely to happen on our side because we remove the mechanism of misinformation. We actively combat that, meaning individuals aren't necessarily to be mobilized. But even if coups happen, we still think there would be a strong French presence until democratic transition and consolidation of democratic norms within the region is likely to happen. Thus then, why do we think they're already losing to today's debate? Because when they talk about things such as changing diplomacy, when they talk about things as utilizing ECOWAS, what it fundamentally relies on is those leaders accepting the people within France. But currently the leaders within West Africa aren't willing to engage with any French individuals. They're actively shutting down media, they're actively pushing these leaders further away, and the French have lost most of their military strongholds. Two individual responses then to what they've said. Firstly, on the CFA franc, note how they haven't shown there's been a shift in currency by many of these African nations. There's a commitment to shift, but there hasn't been that shift. It's something that hasn't happened. It's a potential benefit. But secondly, note if West Africa had its own currency, the instability within the region would have likely just tanked the currency. We don't think they give them a viable solution. ECOWAS, secondly then, panel, is not about defending military forces, it's an economic trade bloc. So all their stuff on security doesn't fall because it's about economic trade. But secondly then, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso pulled away from ECOWAS currently within status quo, which means that there's no capacity to effectively engage with ECOWAS, and the reason why they pulled away was because of their unwillingness to be democratic. Before I go on, sure, I'll take your POI.
You're wrong about the formulation of this motion. This House supports doesn't mean we're status quo, it can mean we're supporting enemy in the future, and by the way, ECOWAS does exist as a pool of military power well as well.
Panel, there's ECOWAS, which is the economic trade bloc, and there's G5. Note on their side, both Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso pulled out of both of these because of the push for them to become significantly more democratic. Why then do we think you get significantly more violence and instability on their side? Currently, what have we seen within the region? There's been a 126% increase in terrorism within Mali that's led to mass civilian harms. The Mora massacre in Mali, a military operation between the Malayan government and the Wagner Group, led to a massacre of 300 civilians. We think these instances are likely to happen significantly more because of the perverse incentives of people like the Wagner Group. This happens for three reasons. Firstly, one, you create a power vacuum as there's no forces actively committed to combating terrorism within the region. The absence of the French has led to peacekeeping operations such as the G5 being non-existent, as African nations and the French have both opted out. Secondly then, there's less resources to combat insurgency. There's been a general decline of military aid within the region as the anti-West sentiments within the region have been growing concurrently. Note how the USA has stopped supplying $2 billion worth of aid in West Africa, which means that the most vulnerable are left without a solution, left without a protection. They don't have the capacity to opt out or to be protected. No, thank you. Thirdly then, let's just engage the Wagner Group panel, because the Wagner Group has led to even greater casualties within the region. There's an indiscriminate use of force due to a lack of accountability measures and an incapacity to separate terrorists from civilians. Individuals are quoted as saying that often they attack people who try to escape. If you run, they're going to kill you because they don't necessarily know who you are. But secondly then, when the UN panel investigated what was happening in West Africa, they recognized that particularly the Wagner Group has violated human rights and committed things such as rape and sexual violence, which are just the latest accusations that have been associated with the group. On the comparative then, we decrease the potential for violence because we have more centralized and collective responses to terrorism within the region. We're likely to still hold the military strongholds because we haven't been pushed out and we've combated anti-West sentiment. Secondly then, we think we have significantly larger allocation of funds to peacekeeping as a result of the Western allyship that France has. This is to say that they're likely going to co-opt the United States as they did prior to 2020 in engaging military operations. The impact here is that you significantly reduce the impact on citizens because they're not forced to leave as a result of the increased human violence. We not put pressure on neighboring countries to house refugees with the potential of leaving citizens vulnerable to abuse. Note, in March and April, it was noted that 7,000 new arrivals of individuals arrived at the UN refugee camp of the Malayan citizens who faced Wagner Group abuse. So what they have to defend is the mass displacement and exposure to violence individuals have faced as a result of French exit. Secondly then, why do we think you get significantly worse political instability? Panel, this is where I speak directly to the ECOWAS thing. Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have withdrawn from ECOWAS because they were being pushed for democratic institutions. But remember, people in West Africa were supported the removal of French forces on the basis that they would get a functional government and a state government. Coup leaders use this as a means of ridding the country of any French neo-colonial rule. What they have to prove is that they're able to guarantee some level of democratization on their side. Why do they fail at this? Firstly, one, junta leaders never give up their power. They've already shut down the French media as a means of limiting the expression of the people, and there's a lack of willingness to support inherently democratic institutions. It looks like the Malayan president being given power to dictate government policy and to dissolve parliament, even though the Supreme Court has called it out as directly unconstitutional. Secondly, then, the claim to power is undemocratic, and there's a lack of effective transitional means to ensure there's a return to civilian rule. Note they've backed themselves with the Wagner Group and Russia, which gives them the necessary military strength to withstand any external pressure. But thirdly, then, we think there's just an ideological incentive between Russia and China to backstop proxies as a means of showing retaliation to the West. They don't want people to buy into democracy so they can be in direct opposition. What's the impact of this argument? We think we protect human rights provisions on our side, as individuals have a direct claim to the Constitution, which is protected through democratic institutions. Note there's non-reliance on benevolent leaders, and we guarantee the benefits to the people on the ground. The reason why we think you ought to vote up is because we save the people on the ground, we ensure their human rights, and we let them stay in their home country. Thank you.
Да. Can I start? My name is Lea and my pronouns are she, her. Okay. France put on a mask of a good guy that they even tried to trick the side of opposition. In my speech, first a few points of rebuttal, then a very important argument about scapegoating. But before that, I want to ask you, what is this debate actually about? The side of opposition tries to really push a very weird burden onto us because we want to point out that no, France did not exit in status quo. They still have politicians, they still control monetary forces, etc. They haven't engaged that. We tell you, on their side, if they still have the same instability in Africa, or people do not want to Africa, they shut down media, etc. How do they fix that stability on their side with more French presence on their side? They haven't encountered this. We tell you that more instability is on their side. Firstly, I want to talk about terrorism and who's taking over, global insecurity, which is their first argument. We tell you, firstly, it is their best case that if their argument stands, we tell you France already defended and weakened a lot of terrorist groups, and African armies can now take over that fighting. But secondly, most terrorist organizations are here because of France. We tell you that France is the reason why Juantas came to power, which are terrorist groups. We tell you this is because of the anti-colonial narrative, where where these terrorist organizations do not support the French government. That is why, because they rise. On our comparative, less people opt into terrorism because they have their own government. Thirdly, we want to present you the truth. We tell you France does nothing in the status quo. That is why there's so much backlash onto them. Their best case is that France is going to defend French factories, French infrastructures, French intel, and not the people of Africa, not the farms, not the schools, not the hospitals. We tell you our comparative, which was also non-engaged, is ECOWAS, which we tell you an example that when they defeated the Afijma mission in 2013 to destroy a coup in Mali. This is also non-rebutted without anything. Secondly, they tell you, oh, but they give you aid, like military aid. We tell you on our side, we still have competition from United States, from UN, and all the different organizations that can give you that aid as well. We tell you there is still an anti-French narrative, not an anti-West narrative. We see this in status quo when we pushed out French military, but let American troops stay. Also, we want to point out their argument about, oh, Wagner Group is going to be so bad in this and they're going to make more instability. Okay, we tell you this is not the case. Why? Because the leader of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, died. That means, because of that, Wagner was now under complete control of Vladimir Putin, who is struggling in providing needed foot soldiers to keep the pressure on Ukraine. Thus, they are already pulling out a great portion of Wagner troops from Africa. Note, there is no sight of war in Ukraine stopping in foreseeable future. That means Putin is likely to pull out more and more Wagner troops from Africa. This is why this is not a very important point. Second point on democracy after this, they tell you, oh, France is pushing democracy onto these African countries. Firstly, what is their incentive and what is their likelihood? We tell you, France does not gain anything from making these countries more democratic. They gain more making them from making more influences, for pushing more of their influences on there. Why? Because they're likely to push their own guys onto positions of power. This is what they're literally doing in status quo. They push French people, they push their governments, where they literally make elections not fair, but they only elect French people. Why? Because it is easier to establish power that way. It is easier to make your politics grow. It is easier to make trade deals you want to make for the likelihood of France and for France to make more money. Secondly, we tell you. Also, we tell you a comparative on our side, which we have still UN, which is likely to push democracy into these countries, but also ECOWAS, which is doing this in status quo. Their only response to ECOWAS is, oh, Niger, Burkina Faso pushed away from ECOWAS. Okay, these are weaker democracies, weaker economies that we do not need for ECOWAS to succeed. We tell you we still have Nigeria and other countries, and even though Niger and Burkina Faso pulled out, they also formed their own coalition. That means they're likely to trade between themselves and also make their economy stronger that way. And secondly, we tell you once ECOWAS is more established, because now we have less French influence because we provided to the likelihood in our second argument, we tell you at that point where ECOWAS is more powerful, more countries are likely to engage because of that we get stronger economies. Sure.
Do you regret the apartheid government negotiating a peaceful transition to democracy in South Africa after there was major pushes for the government to leave as early as 1970?
Okay, I don't see how this is relevant in any way. You cannot just throw examples out here. We're literally giving you likelihood and incentives why France is bad now, why France is bad in West Africa for we do not get to the point of relevance of this argument whatsoever. We tell you that on our side, French presence is the cause of erosion of democracy because they put their own people, they cause unfair elections, but also because populism on their side rises because the French is present on that. We tell you that we fix democracy with our third argument, which is about scapegoating. We tell you there is now to argument about scapegoating. There's a large anti-French narrative in West Africa. This looks like regular riots and protesters, people burning French flags on the streets, massacring French-owned businesses. Literally, we tell you that Mali banned the activities of an NGO funded by France, Burkina Faso suspended the broadcast of French radio. This is the climate in which they want to put more French power and cause more instability. This is because, firstly, West Africa was heavily exploited by French during its colonization. People are aware of this and they hate it. Secondly, citizens see France meddling into their policy, feel their paychecks that money invested isn't trickling down by staying in the arms of French imposed politicians. The French imposed president of Gabon was worth over $130 million, where his country was one of the poorest in Africa. People are tired of the French control and more the de facto independence. What is the problem then? The main incentive of politicians are to stay in power, as they said. They are aware that suggesting specific policies is a risk. It implies spending money and time for policies that might not work or backfire and push you out of the office. So they're always trying to take the path of least resistance. This looks like capitalizing on the anti-French narrative and hate and just blaming the French for all the problems that we have. This is detrimental because, firstly, remember, countries in West Africa are emerging economies. In order to develop, West African governments need to be efficient in terms of planning, infrastructure investments, welfare, tax breaks, etc., economic stimulus bills, etc. The politicians elected by scapegoating haven't come to their positions by merit and effectiveness, which is crucial in developing countries. This means less development, as no effective policies will be made. Secondly,
French presence allows like military juntas to use the wave of anti-French sentiment to coup governments that are present as pro-French and impose dictatorships. A similar things recently happened in like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where the citizens welcomed the coup because they promoted themselves as removing French decolonization, which proves like more instability on their side. Sure.
On your side, if people are pulling out of ECOWAS, how do you strengthen it?
We told you, we literally told you that three most weakest, like most less democratic countries pulled out. We do not need their money. We have other countries who have their own money. Now, because on their side, you no longer give 50% of your money to French reserves. That is the money that we have directly on our side. You get your own money from your own exports. You do not just give it to France. This is the money that the French stole. Now you just put it in your own economy and use it for your own people. It's like very, very logical. What is our comparative on this argument? Once France is gone, so is the common enemy that rallies people to vote for these politicians. Nothing else can rally people to the same manner, because African people are very ethnically and religiously diverse. Nothing else is as unifying for every African person to hate as hating France. This means that politicians cannot center their rules around hate because people are no longer susceptible to that kind of messaging. The way they differentiate themselves on proposition is by becoming solution-oriented, actually finding whose fault is for problems, etc. This is extremely important because only a proposition we get the development that these countries need, but they only prove more instability on their side because they don't have like any counter mechanisms whatsoever. So proud to propose.
Sick, so I'm sorry about my voice. Name, Nisa, she, her pronouns, O2. Panel, I'm a bit confused because I remember when Macron said that he'd pull out of West Africa in February 2023. I remember that, I watched the news. And he did pull out. They pulled out of embassies. France removed themselves from West Africa. So logically, the comparative in the debate and what proposition had to defend was how France pulled out of West Africa, considering that that's already happened. We think it's been very strange that this whole debate, they haven't been willing to defend what's actually happened. We think that strategically lost them the round. What am I going to do in this speech? Firstly, clear up what the strat of the round was and why they just didn't fulfill their burden. Secondly, an economic clash. Lastly, a clash on who's best for security. Cool. Let's firstly look at context here. We think POP's model is just wrong. They want to defend a world in which privatization happens, in which ECOWAS happens, and that's where they derive all of their benefits. But what they had to defend was how France has left West Africa. Why is this the case? Because, firstly, just look at the motion wording, right? It's France's exit out of West Africa. I do English, I understand how an apostrophe works. It has to be possessive, right? So France has already exited. They've decreased aid, they've pulled out, that's the way it's played out. So we think that logically they had to defend this. But secondly, that's the reason we POI'd about Afghanistan. Because the comparative in the debate was whether or not we liked the way France pulled out now, which was abrupt and which was in a way with which they didn't secure democratic institutions, or on our side, a long-term pullout in which they did secure democratic institutions. That was the comparative in the debate. That is what we set up from the first speech. So the reason then that strategically losing them the debate is because on their side of the house, we need to acknowledge what played out. People leave ECOWAS, and they can't just trade this off on their side, because countries like Burkina Faso are still vulnerable countries. So if they want to protect these countries and they think that French influence was bad, then it makes no sense that they're willing to exclude them from that economic benefit. So panel, they had to defend what's played out. They couldn't defend otherwise. But now in these clashes, I'm going to be really charitable and I'm going to engage with their case at their best. Let's look at the economic clash. The first thing they tell us here is that the CFA franc is just really bad, right? People don't want to trade. People can't trade well because it's appreciated, they lose liquidity, etc. Couple of responses. Firstly, the CFA franc is still used on their side. Literally, the military leaders that took over the coups literally said, hey, we're going to keep using the CFA franc because it's a stable currency, and that's the one that we're able to use. Secondly, there's no actual alternative. ECOWAS
ECOWAS has been trying to instill the ECO for many years. Like they've tried it 2 times, and they say that they only estimate it will be installed in 2028, right? And the reason this is structurally true is in order to have a monetary union, it is a prerequisite to have a fiscal union. And that is something you can't really have nicely in West Africa, because these are all very different countries that are all facing different instability causes. So it is very unlikely that even in their best case, they'll be able to form a monetary union. But even if it is the case that they can form a monetary union and they don't use the CFA franc, notice the CFA franc is actually good, panel. It's not that bad on our side. 2 reasons. Firstly, because it allows you to import with a strong currency. So when West African states want to import things, they're not using their weak currency, but they're using a stronger currency, so they have a comparative advantage. But secondly, it is not a floating currency. It is pegged to the euro, which is fairly stable. That means that MNCs and other big countries can't buy out that currency in order to get like lower exports from West Africa, so you get higher margins of benefits from the exports on our side. So even if we do have the CFA franc, we think that's still comparatively better. Second thing they tell us that ECOWAS is better with them, because they can do stuff with a common currency, they can trade with each other, they can pool resources for bargaining power. Let's notice that firstly, they didn't prove why a common currency was possible. I took that out. Secondly, they can't pool resources for the very fundamental reason that Wagner is still there. Yes, the Afghani Prigozhin died, but he's not the only person in Wagner. We think that there are plenty other people, plenty other executives that are continuing to stay. Think about the fact that they just took over new gold mines in Burkina Faso. They are taking over these mines because the deal that these governments have with the Wagner Group is you can take over our resources as long as you protect us from jihadist extremism. So that's the idea that's happening there. So they're losing their mines and they're unable to pool resources because those resources go straight to the Wagner Group. On the comparative, we think we're probably better because if you're still trading with France, at least you get some sort of marginal economic benefit because France pays you for their resources. They don't just give you a service that's inherently unliquid. But a second response to this, let's just notice that there's probably better trade on our side for 2 structural reasons. Firstly, you're not isolated from the West. On their side of the house, when France pulls out and these countries are seen as undemocratic, everybody pulls out too. The Netherlands stopped supporting them. The USA sanctioned them and stopped supporting them. So that means that all the support they would have had on their side is no longer existent. So we think that they're more isolated from the West. But the second reason this is true is because we just don't have as many people pulling out. So we think on our side you're more likely to be a part of ECOWAS because ECOWAS is inherently somebody that wants democratic regimes. Think about Nigeria, who is the biggest contributor in ECOWAS, and the fact that they have opposed all of the coups that have happened and they've opposed the undemocratic regimes that have happened. So the point at which we told you democracy is more likely on our side because France can facilitate it, we think you're more likely to stay in ECOWAS in a stable way. But the last thing they tell us is that you can just make your own agreements. So like it's fine if they're out of ECOWAS. We think they've tried this. They tried with the AES, but it's been proven to be very unsuccessful because they just can't get on the same page. You're dealing with military coup leaders that just have a military focus, not an economic focus, so inherently that just doesn't happen. So the reason we're weighing out and we're winning this economic clash is because we've showed you that on our side you have more control over your resources and you have more ability to dictate how that happens. Before I move on to the second clash, I'll take your point.
The emotion clarification we were given for this motion is that the France's exit involves both the past exit and the future exit because, as we see, CFA franc is still implemented. Please delete the motion.
Okay, cute. Let's just assume that that's the case. Yes, they've exited, but they haven't told us that after France has exited, military leaders and coup leaders that are currently in power just want to give up power to the people. Like even in their best case where that is the case and they can speculate future benefits, they still haven't told us why the military leaders that took over in Mali are just going to give up their power to the people. The reason we can comparatively claim that is because on our side, France doesn't exit in like 2023, and the comparative we told you was from 2020 when they started decreasing support. They kept that support going, so on our side, we can implement democracy better. Cool. Second clash then on who is best for security. What do we get from their side? They tell us that ECOWAS can develop security of these countries. They can fight against terrorism. Yay. 2 responses. Firstly, we think ECOWAS just like doesn't do this. ECOWAS is not a very big military actor for very structural reasons because of the worry that there will be inter-country conflict within ECOWAS. It's the same reason why the AU doesn't have a military because it's very hard to know whose interest to prioritize when implementing that military. But secondly, even if it is the case that ECOWAS can like implement military initiatives, they will always be comparatively worse than the initiatives we can have from France because it is far less centralized and there's far less control compared to France. France, because ECOWAS is a whole union. On our side, it is just one government, so it's far easier to get more precise implementations. And that's particularly important when fighting terrorism, which is something very flexible and inherently constantly changing, so you need something that can have fast implementation. Second thing they tell us is that politically now, they scapegoat France, which is just like really weird because Wagner on their side has a disinformation campaign, so that continues worse on their side. So panel, the reason our arguments are still standing in the debate, as we told you, on their side of the house, there is more violence. On their side of the house, you have individuals like the Wagner group that are fighting against the people, you have instability. And on their side of the house, democracy just doesn't happen because you don't have France to facilitate that process. So the reason your vote goes to opposition is because we ensure that people on the ground have a stable government. We ensure that France doesn't rapidly exit side opposition.
Sorry, just to organize my notes. Okay. Can I be heard if I speak at this volume? Oh, louder? This is fine? Okay, great. Opposition enters this debate with a staggering burden. They need to look at countries like India, countries like South Africa, countries like Brazil, and they need to justify why West Africa needs to be an exception to autonomy and an exception to national liberty. We do not believe they have met this burden in this debate. Two things in my speech. Firstly, on a very important note of housekeeping, and secondly, going through three main clashes showing how proposition 1 all three have been taking the debate. Let's get to the housekeeping. I want to again be very clear on burdens within this debate. It's that this House supports the exit motion. We were very clear, as was the info slide, the exit did not fully happen. We still have more than 10,000 troops existing in West Africa, French troops, which, like, even if you frame the exit as just military, you're just wrong. You still have French control over military policy. You still have French politicians directly in African governments. You still have the colonial tax imposed on these governments. It's simply untrue that France does not remain here in any capacity, which means on burdens, they have to defend the status quo, the exit that did happen, and we are the change in this side. The implication here is that most of their comparative call falls. This means they cannot claim establishing any democratic institutions or additional fighting on terrorism without proving the incentive of France to do this. They cannot just assert they have a comparative to this. And again, I just want to point out this was elaborated on by the motion clarification. Let's get to the first clash then on the economy. O2 realizes they're not really debating the motion, so we only get some real responses from her for the first time. Firstly, on the CFA franc, she says three things here. Firstly, that it's impossible to really like establish this any currency which would rival the CFA franc because it had to be a fiscal union, not just a monetary union. First of all, this is just completely wrong. Like the CFA franc countries right now are not in a fiscal union. They're just like have the same monetary, they just have like similar economic goals because they're both export-oriented countries and can exist in a monetary union. And we can see other examples like the European Union. Is that a fiscal union? No, it's not. It's literally a union of completely different countries. They're just united in monetary policy. Very simple. Secondly, they claim the CFA franc is not really that bad because it eases exports for these countries. We believe this is true to an extent, but it doesn't actually matter because on weighing, these are unique countries in that their entire economy is based on exports. That means the way they make the money by which they pay for the products which are supposedly cheaper to import is by exporting most of their economy, and that's how they gain revenue. This means the most impactful thing we can do for them is increase how much money they get per unit of export. And thirdly, she claims, but the euro is much more stable than this currency which is likely to be implemented. Firstly, we receive absolutely no analysis as to why this new currency is unlikely to be stable. We think this is actually we think the opposite is actually very intuitive. Insofar as France leaves and you need to attract investors, you need to make sure that you have like signaling stability in your country to attract people to replace France's investment. We think it's very likely you try very hard to have a stable currency. They can't just assert the euro is more stable. Even if it is, it's stable in the worst way possible. It's stable at keeping your country not having a good monetary policy. And I want to flag in this clash, they did not respond to our point on these countries simply having more money on our side. They have to defend a comparative in which African countries only have access to 20% of the net income they made last year. Even if we get no impact on the CFA franc and like growing their economy, we still get a lot more money to be used for projects in the status quo. How do we weigh the autonomy these countries have over their monetary policy? In crisis situations, I want to flag this is not very uncommon. Things like droughts, terror attacks, etc., other situations that might lead to supply shocks are very common in West Africa. These countries need to be able to adjust their monetary policy to recover from these crises. Otherwise, their exports might be unfavorable for months on end and the country won't be making any capital. Notice this is important because even if opposition proves a long-term pathway towards development on their side, these crises, which happen quite commonly, set the country back severely and often enough so that any long-term development is mitigated. Before moving on to the second clash, I'll take a point.
If you support Africans choosing their solutions, do you support the Wagner Group being their solution, which is yes, the pillaging of villages and the abuse?
Obviously, I will get to the Wagner point later. Okay, second clash then on ECOWAS. I'm going to split this clash into two parts, the influence of ECOWAS on trade and the influence of ECOWAS on security. At the top, I want to clarify our mechanism here. We claim that yes, ECOWAS is not very powerful in the status quo, but that is because countries do not need to rely on it. Once France leaves, ECOWAS has to fill some of the shoes that France left behind. For example, we've told you why these countries do have an incentive to have a shared currency. Since the CFA franc is now gone on our side, ECOWAS is the only body with the political legitimacy and capacity to implement this currency. Because of this, it becomes much more powerful and much more influential on our side. They say, but countries left in the status quo. But exactly, they left because they could leave in the status quo. On your side, any trade and security benefits that ECOWAS still has are likely to be destroyed once everyone leaves from ECOWAS because it's not important. On our side, once it's a more relevant institution, firstly, countries are likely to return, and secondly, even if countries do not return, we're glad to bite the bullet insofar as the most relevant politically and economically countries like Nigeria are still here, and only the poorest and least populated countries have left. Okay, how do we get then to the trade part of this clash? They did not actually respond to anything we've told you on trade in this clash because they just said that like ECOWAS is too weak. So I'm going to weigh why our point here is so important. Notice it is uncertain and difficult for either side in this debate to prove the economic growth or diversification of West Africa. That's why this point brings the least risky and most plausible and most proximate impact to these countries, right? Because with ECOWAS, they can extract the most value from the status quo system, from like these exports that they currently have. We've told you this in our mechanism. This means that even if we don't prove any better monetary or fiscal policy on our side, the export point still stands and they can get more money from the same thing that they do in the status quo. And also again, notice the scale of this impact insofar as these are export-based economies. This means even a marginal increase to the value they get per export on their side is a huge GDP we get on our side. Okay. Secondly then to the security point, they've told us two things here. Firstly, they've told us, your security point doesn't really stand because ECOWAS doesn't function as a military union. I think they've conceded this is just wrong in the status quo. I'm not going to spend any more time on this. Secondly, they've told us, security on your side is worse because of Wagner. Notice after Prigozhin's death, Wagner is completely under the control of Vladimir Putin. Insofar as you have a war in Ukraine, which shows no signs of slowing down, and Vladimir Putin is certainly not like landslide winning, troops are currently being pulled out, and more so, they're likely to be pulled out way more in the future, or at least no troops are likely to be added. So we think Wagner is really not an important point of this debate. And further, they claim, the security point really isn't good because it's important for security to be centralized. We think it's precisely the opposite. In West Africa, once you have split terrorist cells in between all of these nations, we think it's very, very important to have decentralized cooperation with information that all countries can offer so that you can root out terrorism from the bottom. And I want to point out within this point, we've received no comparative on what they can actually do about security. They've told us, France can help, but we see France not helping in the status quo. Since they only have a monetary incentive, insofar as they only protect factories, they only protect mines, we've told you why it's exclusively important that security be pivoted to the militaries of these nations that actually have a direct incentive to help the people in that country. I want to get to the third clash then quickly on scapegoating. It's not really a clash because they didn't respond to it independently. They've just repeated the Wagner point, which I've already rebutted. So let's weigh why scapegoating is so important within this debate. Notice on proposition, even if all of our impacts on the economy or whatever fall, all of the countries in West Africa on their side are much more likely to become military juntas. Once you can scapegoat to France on their side, this is how these terrorist leaders, how these insurrectionist leaders actually gain popularity within the country and are actually able to rise to the ranks of power. For all of these reasons, for the security, for the economy of West Africa, and for the benefit of the average citizen there, we beg you to propose.
Pronouns. I'd like to apologize in advance for the glasses. I broke my regular prescriptions. And in that case, I'll be starting off in 3, 2, 1. As a debater, I've always disliked Africa debates because it always seems like a comparison of trash versus garbage, a comparison of the colonial control that France has established versus the destruction that Russia is wreaking across the country. But note that Africa debates are about harm reduction, and what we push on our side is the idea that at the very least we want democratic transition. They push us to demonstrate why West Africa is going to be an exception to every other norm that's demonstrated throughout history. Quite simple, because in these countries, Nelson Mandela took power in comparison to democratic or in comparison to military leaders like Abdou Abramane in Niger. Those are the people who have benefited directly from France's pullout, and those are the people that they have to champion on our side. Let me do some clarification before I move on to my two clashes. Firstly, on the Wagner Group, and secondly, on the idea of economic beneficiaries. So the contextualization is this. The transition from France has created a coup belt across the Sahel region. It's created military governments that run political capture based on anti-French sentiments. These are people that champion anti-French sentiments as a means of getting control. But this is what they disregard. Crucially, that anti-French sentiment is something that was directly backed by the French exit. That is, when France withdrew, when France allowed Russia to run rampant disinformation campaigns, when France withdrew its military investment in counter-terrorism mechanisms, all of those things undermined its previous popularity in the region. It meant that people went from hating the France to hating the France even more and being actively weaponized against them in a way that enabled these military dictatorships. On comparative, we supported continuous investment of the French. We supported the French combating that disinformation campaign, building up democratic institutions, the alternative that prevents the harms they characterize under status quo from manifesting. They never demonstrate any reason why the future is going to be better, why Abdou Armaham is going to reduce his control in this military junta under status quo, why the democracy is likely to take shape under their side of the model. They have to support the exit in the way that it occurs, and the reason then has already been demonstrated. And note that France had massive amounts of ties and aid agreements with the previous civilian governments that were replaced by the ones that currently exist, which means there was a minimal incentive, unless they pulled out, for this transition to take place. If they were able to entrench that colonial control, we think that's better than the comparative. On the first clash then, the idea of ECOWAS. And I'd like to frame here that when they try to co-opt our benefits of, hey, the French are still involved, they also have a minimal delta on their side. You don't get much of a benefit if African solutions to African problems still involves the French being majorly invested in everything. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about the Wagner Group and the creation of chaos within West Africa. The first question is Russia and China actually going to fill this vacuum? And note the flimsiness of the mechanism they gave you. The idea of popular suspicion. We're not just going to lean on a different actor because we thought that didn't work before. 3 responses. 1, the idea of leveraged anti-French sentiment. The likelihood to support any alternative other than the French. This is supported by Wagner disinformation. Secondly, the previous relationships with the USSR in the 1960s and 70s. That creates a nostalgia that makes people more likely to buy into Russian propaganda. But lastly, the idea that this is just unrealistic. You are weak states. You are states that have been constituted with lines that are artificially drawn and minimal democratic cooperation. That lack of resources means you need to lean on something. They didn't regard then the idea that you're leaning on the Wagner Group. And this takes out the majority of their analysis on scapegoating, because that scapegoating was actually caused by France relaxing its control in the region, by France allowing for disinformation to occur. But secondly, note all of the political impacts they give you are completely symmetrical, because what they tell you is people are no longer able to lie on anti-French sentiment, and because we're so diverse in these countries, we are going to just stop championing politics based on hate. That's stupid, because what we do instead is champion politics based on hate for each other. That's what groups have consistently done within African states because of those tribal tensions, and it's something that's unlikely to change on either side. So even in their very best case, the political impacts are barely impactful. Second conversation then, what is our ability to impact and suppress jihadists on our side? What they say is jihadists are just here because of France. 3 responses. 1, jihadists are here because of opportunity. And so when France pulls out, they have an opportunity to entrench their power and continue their fight against the West from an established base. But note secondly, that jihadism is actively worsened on their side because the Embera refugee camp that's caused by Wagner violence is something that actively radicalizes people, because people have had their homes destroyed by Russian activists with minimal accountability. All of that opacity analysis was given in Lisa's speech, and that's something that further radicalizes people and makes these problems even worse. But secondly, I'd like to talk about the French incentives for stability on our side. Firstly, there's an old Republican wing within France that holds democratic ideals very close to their heart. They feel very possessive of old colonial territories, and they don't want to see them backslide into that idea of like complete and utter chaos. And note, that's neo-colonial in its nature, but it's far preferable to the comparative. Secondly, note that France is fixed to democratic norms, which means you've signed onto UN charters, you abide to those charters, you're not going to roll around protecting minds at the expenses of civilians. But lastly, note this is an active refugee crisis that's created by terrorism. Marine Le Pen and the Popular Front have been pushing against that, which means when masses of people flee from Mauritania into France as a result of terrorism metrics, that creates a direct incentive for the French to look out for them. On comparative, the Wagner Group has a vested incentive for resource grabs, and this takes out the Ukraine analysis, because Putin isn't going to pull troops from Africa to Ukraine if those troops are actively giving him money to fund the wars. That looks like the unmarked military vehicles that walk around the Central African Republic to protect the gold mines that the Wagner Group directly benefits from. That's a direct incentive for disability in these nations in comparison to the French ones. Before I move on to the second conversation about the economy, sure, I'll take your point.
If I ignore this is a new response in 03, it's still vocal and insulting to claim West African theater propaganda post-France's exit to hate it. On your side, they hate it still for being France, and when France states this allows military juntas to
yes,
use that hate.
They hate it for being France. That's very much correct. But what does that hate do on your side? That hate is actively weaponized. That hate is used as a means of support for authoritarian regimes, whereas on the comparative, that support for those regimes wouldn't exist. That's why Russia is championed while the French flag is burned, and that's that active coup, that active grab for power that you incentivize on your side. That's insulting. Second conversation, the idea that economically speaking, this isn't beneficial. What they tell you is that African states are able to develop on their side, and this is something that's enforced by France. 5 responses. Firstly, note the differing incentives that exist between France and the Western powers that they support. France is a slow-growing economy. It's something that has a direct incentive to create capacity, to shift the labor-intensive jobs to these states to allow for them to develop. On the comparative, China gets active benefit from pulling oil from Chad because it has a very developed manufacturing economy that can still benefit from that. Secondly, the idea of asserted stability. You don't have property rights, you have resources that are given to elites. It's unlikely that they demonstrate this investment is something that's going to come in. Thirdly, let's talk about the fact that their sole benefit is flexibility. You can allocate money here or here dependent on need. Note that currency unions don't give you that capacity. Think of the Eurozone crisis. Think of all of the inflation that's generated when you have to support a weaker nation. That is something that actively reduces the flexibility they want to claim. But fourthly, note the asserted similarity of positions. Nigeria is a lot more developed than Burkina Faso, and as a result, that's going to alter the incentives they have when it comes to these unions. Fifthly, though, where does this trade happen? Are you shipping raw materials from one African nation to the other? Where is the active investment or development that's created? That's worsened by the fact that they cut off relations to the places where you'd be shipping these resources under status quo. They reduce capacity, they worsen the economy, they allow terrorists to run rampant. Put your ballot with the green and gold where it matters.
It's clear a team has lost a debate when they have to just lie about what's happened. Supposedly Wagner starts pulling out, supposedly France didn't actually exit. We just don't think that's the way it's played out in status quo. So if we're working contextually, they lost from P1. But what am I going to do here? Let's firstly clear up what the strat of the round was and why strategically their case was uncomparative. Secondly, a clash on economics, and then lastly a clash on stability. Firstly, on strat. We think their line was wrong. We tell you this from 01, we push it down bench. They tell us about this random exit that would strangely have all these benefits. ECOWAS works out, etc., etc. We already told you why structurally this wasn't the case, because they've already pulled out, that's what they had to defend. But panel, even in their best case, this line wasn't debate winning, for 2 fundamental reasons. Firstly, it still doesn't tell us why after military coups and all of that, we weren't going to still pull out of ECOWAS. They don't tell us why actors like Nigeria are now really fond of those authoritarian leaders. So factually, they don't tell us why ECOWAS is something they can claim. But secondly, it's not debate winning because they don't tell us why democracy is likely with them. I still don't understand why those military leaders are willing to give up power on their side of the house, assuming that the coups happen because of the way France exits. So fundamentally, their line was unstrategic and not debate winning. But the second thing is that they're just not comparative as to what's happened in status quo with the Wagner Group and with China. We tell you that the Wagner Group and China have increased their influence in the region. We told you that they get resources and are able to funnel that back. So even in the context in which Putin takes over, we think they want those resources. So if their biggest harm was colonization, but they allow the Wagner Group to take out resources, we think quite fundamentally they've just done colonization ×2. Let's then look at the clashes. First clash was on economics. What did we give you? We told you that the Wagner Group has a stronghold over resources, and this is bad because they don't compensate these countries with money. But secondly, that these countries get sanctioned on their side, this is something bad. What they told you is firstly, the CFA franc is super good and ECOWAS is also super good. 2 of their weighing metrics as to why just on benefits alone we weigh out. Firstly, because it's about being centralized versus decentralized. On our side, even if we have like decreased effectiveness of ECOWAS, we still can claim the West. So in the worst instance in which ECOWAS becomes unstable, we still have other actors we can depend on. Their entire case is hung on the idea that ECOWAS just starts working really automatically, so they don't actually have security. But secondly, notice, their case is just far too long-term. We think even if their case does happen, it happens so far in the future that right now the economy is still bad. Right now, you're still really unstable. They don't give us structural reasons as to why this monetary union just happens like that. So understanding we're weighing out on economics, what's the second clash here? The second clash is on stability. We gave you two really big arguments that got limited engagement. We firstly told you that there is increased violence because firstly, France is needed to fight against extremism. They've been successful. They were able to decapitate one of the leaders of Al-Qaeda. Secondly, we have higher resources on our side to combat insurgencies, but thirdly, the Wagner Group harms civilians. But a second argument we give under this clash is to say that there's increased democracy on our side, because military coup leaders reject democracy on their side, and France has an incentive to implement democracy for their reputation. What they give us then, panel, is they tell us that propaganda is really bad, which we find very strange because the Wagner Group is the one pushing disinformation. But secondly, they tell us that ECOWAS can fight back. Three-way metrics why just on value we weigh out on this clash. Firstly, because on our side there's just a greater pool of resources. So even if they did have good organization, we can fight jihadists better because we just have fundamentally more resources because more countries are involved. Secondly, we prevent harm from getting too extreme. So on their side, they have to defend a world after the coups happen. We defend a world in which those coups don't happen. So the harm we're trying to mitigate is less. But thirdly, we're able to rely on people who we can trust. They have to rely on groups like the Wagner Group that are known to harm civilians. We rely on French troops that are more accountable. So panel, the only exit that should happen is us with the W side opposition.
You know opposition is losing, but they only respond to our argument about scapegoating in our analysis which was in first in the third argument. Please kindly disregard all the new material. In my reply, I first we talked about economy, second democracy, third security. Let's first talk about economy. We have asked them a simple question. How much money West Africa has on their side and on our side? It tells you, in status quo, most money France takes and puts into their French world. That means they take 50% of all the money that West African countries make. That means A, they do not have the freedom to use it in any way or to use it on its people. B, in crisis situations, they cannot respond fast enough to floods, earthquakes, and people die. This is left unresponsible. We then provided our comparative of ECOWAS, which was always called, oh no, two countries left. We told you these countries are like meaningless. They literally have the lowest economies, lowest democracy. We still have likelihood analysis in our second argument about how this is going to be better. They haven't also responded to the high exchange rate of CFA franc, etc. We tell you that because of that I'm going to be charitable and talk about their characterization of how China is going to come. We tell you China is going to come in the forms of BRI and investments and not stealing in military resources, material and military. Secondly, about democracy, we want to ask you, how do they on their side achieve anything? Because we tell you, how does France implement democracy in a country which protects its involvement in Africa because people still hate French on their side? They haven't proven it in the analysis. We called it out in a second. They can't prove to you where they have, because of that, they have more instability because they can't prove to you how they get away from Wagner groups, how they have less terrorism on their side, where they steal people, how are people going to cooperate with that on their side. Thirdly, about security. We tell them how does France help on their side because they say, oh, people only left when escape from France once France exited. This is literally absurd. Think, France only left because Africans backlash. Backlash because France did nothing about terrorism. So how does France help about terrorism, which is the strongest push in which they close down spend most of their time talking about. It doesn't help in that as well. We tell you it protects French minds, French factories, etc. That is why many terrorist organizations only come to be because of hatred for France. On our side, we literally have less terrorist organizations from the start. Why? But secondly, we also want to ask you the question, why exclusively French has to do that? We tell you still have the United States, you still have the UN. We literally see that the United States troops haven't pulled out from Africa in the status quo even when France left the Southern Lines. We then come to you also our comparative of ECOWAS. We tell you an example of a coup on Mali, which was like they defeated the coup on Mali. This is literally an example how they're very successful because they have the incentive to protect their people, not only French factories. Why? Because this is their water base, and because of our argument about scapegoating, which now you cannot have this common enemy, oh, France is bad, this is their fault when this is happening. I really held politicians accountable to do things. They also have the capacity, which we point to you in an argument about like sharing intel, etc. Certainly, like on the back group, we told you they pulled out mostly from Africa. But even if they didn't, we tell you how these other how our comparatives can deal with this, how they can still like defeat them and have like less incentive with that. Because on our side, economy is greater. Why? Because France, because France only has incentive of their own money, of their own resources. This is literally why they built it. This is literally why they have the colonial tax and the status quo only to make money. They do not want these countries to remain democracies. They do not want these countries to prosper on their own. They're implementing their own people in the heads of governments. They're not giving the money to develop. On our side, these governments can actually have that. We proved to you through a mechanism of scapegoating, which was only responded in their third. Please disregard this. We told you that on our side, people have the capacity because now they have their own money. They can form coalitions, and on our side, their actual politicians are actually held accountable. That means they can make the best decisions for the people. Because we get economy and because we get more security on our side, please vote for